CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Police attacked and buses burned. Northern Ireland erupts in violence in the worst disturbances in years.
Our other headlines: Myanmar's ambassador to the UK sleeps in his car after being locked out of his embassy and fired from his job.
The European Court of Human Rights gives a ruling on compulsory vaccinations, which could set a precedent for coronavirus jabs.
And in our special 100 days of Brexit, cheesemakers say a slice of their export market has melted away. Northern Ireland's power-sharing government has called for calm following nights of rioting in several towns and cities. It's held an emergency meeting to discuss the violence, with Britain's Minister for Northern Ireland travelling to Belfast for urgent talks. A bus was hijacked and set on fire in the city on Wednesday. 10 people have been arrested during clashes in areas largely populated with loyalists, those who wish to remain part of the UK. Many are frustrated over new post-Brexit trade barriers. Yolo Abdavid reports.
It's been a week of rioting and disturbances in Northern Ireland. Scenes reminiscent of decades ago, forcing the police to respond. It's deeply political, even though most of the youths causing damage weren't even born when Irish Republicans and pro-British loyalist groups were attacking each other in the 1970s and 80s. The Good Friday Agreement, signed 23 years ago, ended decades of violence. But this week has seen rioting in several towns as frustrations boiled over. Dozens of police officers have been injured. A motion before the Northern Irish Assembly asks for support for the police and an immediate end to violence.
The harm to Northern Ireland's image in this, our centenary year, has taken us backwards. And no brick, no bottle, no petrol bomb thrown has achieved or can ever achieve anything but destruction, harm and fear.
Nobody could fail to be alarmed by the fact that these are young people, children as young as 13, barely a teenager, that are involved in rioting, both at Sandy Row and then last night, again, similar scenes at Lanark Way. It's not right, it's dangerous, it's unacceptable.
Boris Johnson has voiced his deep concern at scenes in a part of the United Kingdom that has been impacted more than most with the decision to leave the European Union. There's anger at how Brexit affects trade in and out differently to the rest of the UK. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has been sent for urgent talks. So far, some have been arrested, but confidence in the police has been dented with calls earlier this week for the Chief Constable to resign. American presidents always watch events in Northern Ireland. The US were heavily involved in the 1998 peace agreement, and just a few weeks ago, the current president, who has family connections in Ireland, reiterated its importance.
On the Good Friday agreements, we strongly support them, think it's critically important to be maintained. And the political and economic stability of Northern Ireland is very much in the interest of all our peoples, the people-to-people ties.
All political parties have criticised the disorder, but it's mostly blamed on loyalist frustration about a decision not to prosecute those who attended a large-scale funeral of a senior Republican figure last summer, as well as concerns about the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland.
Yolo, why are we seeing this violence now?
Well, it is a simmering tension because of Brexit and because of COVID lockdowns as well. There's a lot of divide and resentment, not least because of what's been happening in the last few months. And also remember, we're only 2 days away from the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and there are still people in Northern Ireland who are not entirely happy about the Good Friday Agreement, even though the majority of people would be. Now, the resentment, as I referred to, was about one funeral of a senior Republican that took place last summer, and there were many Sinn Féin leaders and prominent politicians there flouting what were the lockdown rules at the time. And there was a feeling amongst loyalist communities that possibly these Republicans were just taking liberties and getting away with it. And that's been simmering for a long time. And then you have Brexit. And Brexit, as we have seen since January, that there are now different regulations and rules on trade coming in and out of Northern Ireland, over the sea from the rest of Britain, but also across the border from the Republic of Ireland to the south. And they feel that this accentuates the differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And they're very, very unhappy about that. And that's why we have seen such a lot of violence in the last week, because this has been building up slowly and suddenly it's exploded.
Well, Brexit's here to stay. Solutions to trying to resolve this are going to be very challenging, aren't they?
They are going to be challenging, and more than likely they'll have to be found in Northern Ireland itself, because you do have two opposing political ideologies sharing the executive power in Northern Ireland. Yes, you can have the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying he's gravely concerned. He sends the Northern Ireland Secretary to Belfast to talk to all concerned. We know how every American president feels about the Good Friday Agreement, most of them at least, and that's why Joe Biden was involved in his comments and is always watching what happens in Northern Ireland. But also you have local resentments, and you have people unhappy about policing, unhappy about social issues in Northern Ireland. That can only be sorted out locally. And when you have leaders like the First Minister, who is the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, saying that the writing is an embarrassment for Northern Ireland, and yet then says this does not reflect what happens in loyalist communities, and blames Sinn Féin and the Republicans immediately, then you can see how divided, even in that coalition government in Northern Ireland, how divided they are. What the police will have to do is to try and stop 12 and 13-year-olds throwing petrol bombs at buses, and they will have to try and root out the extremists which might be encouraging these actions.
Yolo Abdavid, thank you very much. And we'll have much more from Northern Ireland in our special report on the stresses and strains Brexit has placed on the UK and its nations in the world today, this Saturday. That's part of our week-long look at Brexit 100 days on.
Myanmar's ambassador to the UK has been forced to spend the night in his car after being dismissed and locked out of the country's embassy in London. Kyaw Soe Min had criticised the military takeover of his country and called for Aung San Suu Kyi to be released. Nicole Johnston reports.
Tell us what happened. Please, it's very important to tell the world.
Coup. You understand that it's kind of coup. In the middle of London, this kind of coup is not going to happen.
Locked out of the embassy, Myanmar's former ambassador.
Okay. You can see that, they occupy my building.
Kyaw Soe Min spent Wednesday night in his car after he was asked by Myanmar's military to leave the embassy building along with his staff. On Thursday, Min was back, outside at least, calling on the British government not to recognise Myanmar's new envoy in London and to send him home. So how did it come to this? Last month, Kyaw Soe Min criticised Myanmar's military and called for ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi to be released. On Thursday, he gave this statement through a spokesperson.
Due to his announcement in March, the ambassador has been recalled by the Myanmar military regime. Since then, he stopped following instructions from Myanmar Foreign Ministry, and he has been meeting with many diplomatic counterparts and Myanmar community to discuss the current situation in Myanmar, hoping to find a peaceful solution.
British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab posted on Twitter, "We condemn the bullying actions of the Myanmar military regime in London yesterday, and I pay tribute to Kyaw Soe Min for his courage. The UK continues to call for an end to the coup and the appalling violence and a swift restoration of democracy." Myanmar's military took power on the 1st of February, leading to weeks of protests. More than 600 people are reported to have been killed. So former Ambassador Cho Za-min is out of the embassy and out of a job. His deputy ambassador has taken over. The Myanmar government says Min has been summoned home.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Nicole Johnston, who's at the embassy in London now. Nicole, good to see you. Well, what's the latest from the Myanmar embassy?
Well, as you can see behind me, it's now very quiet. There's a number of police here as well as media, but it was a different picture earlier in the day. There was a large, noisy number of protesters here showing their support for the former ambassador, but that's now quietened off. But no surprises that we've come to this sort of showdown. In March, as we heard in that story, Cho Za-min broke ranks with Myanmar's military rulers, so it was inevitable that we would reach some kind of showdown. In the location behind me, the Myanmar embassy has become the place for it. At this stage, though, the reports are that the deputy ambassador has taken over. The UK Foreign Office has said that there is no confirmation of that yet. And as for whoever is in the building, we haven't seen anybody thus far.
How tricky is this diplomatically for the UK?
Well, it's quite a difficult diplomatic situation for them, and one of the reasons for that is what happens to the former ambassador now. If he returns to Myanmar, it's likely he would be arrested, so he could stay here potentially, apply for asylum. And then one of the issues for the Foreign Office has been under the international protocols ruling foreign affairs. It effectively has to accept whoever becomes the new ambassador. So the UK Foreign Office has said that it's received confirmation that Cho Za-min's appointment is over. The Foreign Office is forced to accept that, but at the same time it won't want to show any kind of tacit acceptance of the military rulers in Myanmar. So it is a difficult diplomatic situation for them. Clearly the UK Foreign Office is supporting the former ambassador, but there's very little they can do about it.
Nicole Johnston, thanks for the update.
The online fashion retailer ASOS has more than tripled its half-year profits to a record $145 million. The UK company has seen strong demand for casual wear during the pandemic, resulting in profits soaring by more than 250%. Earlier this year, ASOS brought the Topshop brand following the collapse of Sir Philip Green's Arcadia empire. The global clothing company Uniqlo has reported a 23% jump in half-yearly profits, helped by a buying surge in China. The Japanese brand has been among the most resilient retailers during the pandemic. It reported operating profits of $1.5 billion for the first half of this fiscal year, and it's looking to accelerate its expansion in Asia, with 100 shop openings planned in 2021. HSBC and JP Morgan will have thousands of employees working permanently from home in the latest sign that the pandemic will leave lasting changes to our working patterns. Up to 1,200 workers at HSBC call centres could make a permanent switch to remote working. Separately, 10% of JP Morgan's 255,000 employees may work from home full-time, while other staff will continue to work at home for some of the time. Tencent's largest shareholder has sold nearly $15 billion worth of stock in the Chinese tech giant. The Amsterdam-based investment group Prosus sold a 2% stake in what is one of the world's largest ever block trades. Prosus says it won't sell any further Tencent shares for at least the next 3 years and retains a 28.9% stake. Beijing is now home to more billionaires than any other city in the world. According to the latest Forbes annual rich list, the Chinese capital is home to 100 billionaires, narrowly beating New York, which is home to 99 and has held top ranking for 7 years. The president of the World Bank is warning leaders against setting a global minimum tax rate for companies that is too high. All this comes after US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called for all countries to agree to a minimum rate of 21%. Yellen wants to work with G20 countries to agree a rate and end what she calls a 30-year race to the bottom. The French finance minister has just said he's open to a rate above 12.5%. Well, let's talk to Tommaso Faccio from the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. Good to see you. Welcome to the programme. For those of us who aren't immersed in corporation tax rates, just explain to us what are the pitfalls of all countries agreeing to a minimum tax rate of 21%.
Thank you for the invite. I think the proposal from the US administration is a game changer in the fighting against tax havens. It will set a floor so that multinationals will pay a minimum tax in each country they operate. So they will no longer be able to shift profits to tax havens. And this is a reflection on a new thinking, which is that lowering tax for corporations doesn't spur investment. It doesn't create new jobs. And so we've seen that in the UK with the proposed changes to raising corporation tax to 25%. We've seen that in the US with this new proposal to increase corporation tax to 28% from 21%, but also to increase the minimum tax to 21%, calculated on a country-by-country basis. So if there are profits over US multinationals in the Cayman Islands or in Ireland, they will ultimately be taxed at 21% in the US. So the pitfalls really here are for the multinationals, because they will have to pay more taxes. But multinationals are the big winners of globalization. And you mentioned in your previous talk about the rise in the wealth of billionaires. And we've seen that multinationals have so far been able to avoid paying corporation tax through tax avoidance at around $250 billion per year. That's the cost to the revenues of governments, and in particular in a time of crisis like now, this funding is much needed. So I think the pitfalls will be mostly for the multinationals. So the hope is that they will be able to agree a global minimum tax of 21%, because the OECD, the G20 average tax rate is around 25–26%, and most small and medium businesses that only operate at country level, they pay tax at the full rate. They're not able to shift profits.
Okay, the big challenge with this, I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it? I mean, the big challenge with this is that it might hinder poorer countries who want to set a low corporation tax to attract big companies to their countries. That's a fair criticism, isn't it?
I disagree a bit with that, because the data shows that financial flows arrive to countries in the global south, but this does not result in increased investment. So basically, what the current system allows countries to compete with each other for taking investment, and some of that investment would have taken place anyway. And so if we just look at the data, historic data, research done by the International Monetary Fund and others, it shows that this tax competition does not lead to new jobs, new infrastructure being created in those countries. And this is the gamble that the US administration is taking, asking multinationals to pay for corporate taxes so they can fund infrastructure, they can fund, provide resources to face the different crises, like the climate crisis, inequality crisis.
Tommaso Faccio, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, this is Joe Biden currently unveiling some sweeping executive actions on gun control. These are live pictures. We'll have more.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link. only on CGTN.
Don't forget you can sign up to our daily newsletter. We bring you all the top business headlines straight to your inbox. So sign up for free at this address. CGTN. See the difference.
It's a question we've been waiting almost 5 years to answer. It affects millions of people and billions worth of business. Now's the time to answer, what does Brexit mean? CGTN Europe has asked people across Europe. We've analysed the discussion on social media, and we've looked at the facts and figures. Are you one of those who's already feeling the change? Did you take part in the debate on social media? Join us throughout the week on television and online to mark 100 days since the UK reset its relationship with the EU. And have your say as part of our live and interactive show on Facebook from 12 GMT on Sunday the 11th of April. Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that compulsory vaccinations are legal and may be necessary in democratic societies. The case focused on preschool vaccinations, but could set a precedent for COVID-19 campaigns. And all this comes as Europe once again appears divided on vaccinations, with member states taking different approaches to the AstraZeneca jab. Tony Waterman reports from Brussels.
Despite repeated pleas from Brussels for a common approach to the coronavirus pandemic, EU member states have consistently done as they please, from borders to travel restrictions to vaccines. Bloc-wide unity has been hard to come by. And it appears no different with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Mere hours after the EU drugs regulator deemed it safe for use across all age groups, despite confirming a link to very rare but serious blood clots, splintering was in full effect. The way forward decided on different interpretations of the EMA safety report.
We have decided as a precaution to administer the vaccine to those who can benefit the most. That is the elderly.
Italy and Belgium joined Germany, France and the Netherlands in limiting the jab's use to older age groups, somewhere between 55 and 60 depending on the country. Spain went even further, restricting its use to people aged 60 to 65 only, while Denmark maintained a full suspension of the shot. In the UK, which is no longer part of the EU, the vaccine advisory body said under 30s should be offered a different vaccine where one is available.
The balance of benefits and risks is very favourable for older people, but it is more finely balanced for the younger people.
Opinions also diverge on what to do about second doses. Germany says under 60s should now get a different vaccine. Others are holding out for more scientific data.
With regard to the second dose, this is an issue that has yet to be determined. We are waiting to see studies that could, on the basis of scientific evidence, support the administration of a second dose with another vaccine.
The varying approaches risks confusing the public and further undermining confidence. Many Europeans are already skeptical about the lightning speed development and approval of COVID-19 vaccines, and hesitancy has hampered their uptake. On Thursday, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that mandatory vaccinations were legal and may be necessary in democratic societies. The case didn't deal directly with COVID-19 vaccines, but it could set a precedent for the future. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
Meanwhile, the debate over lockdown restrictions in Germany is heating up as some regions move towards reopening, despite pleas from Angela Merkel to stay closed. The German Chancellor will meet state leaders next week and faces an uphill battle to reach a consensus. Trent Murray reports now from Frankfurt.
The chorus of voices calling for a harder lockdown in Germany continues to grow louder. There are signs Chancellor Angela Merkel is laying the groundwork to try and convince state leaders to sign on to her plans to keep Germany closed because of COVID-19. Her spokesperson telling reporters urgent action is needed because of the third wave.
Intensive care physicians are worried and are sending warnings. That's why calls for a short, uniform lockdown are justified. It's also important to have a joint, uniform approach throughout Germany because what we are talking about, joint measures and joint action. At the moment, the range of different rules adopted across the country does help encourage acceptance.
But opinion on the best course of action does differ between the states. The region of Saarland, which sits on the French border, has begun to reopen large swathes of its economy against the wishes of the Chancellor. The mayor of the region's capital city, Saarbrücken, telling CGTN he's confident their strategy is safe.
We believe this is the right approach, not just to open everything uncontrollably, but to take a policy of slow and controlled small steps. This is the way Saarland is going. Is this a model for all the other regions in Germany? No, but I believe that when we think about the economic situation in our state and also the mental impact on people, it's very important to give a signal of hope that this pandemic will end. And even in this third wave, not everything will simply close up completely again.
The debate and discussion over lockdown restrictions comes as the country really tries to speed up its sluggish vaccine rollout. Mass vaccination sites like this one have been operating since December, but from this week, family doctors have been given the green light to start administering the jabs. It's hoped that GPs may just hold the key to helping Germany hit some of those higher numbers like we've seen in the US, UK and Israel. Chancellor Merkel will meet with state premiers on Monday to discuss the next phase of pandemic response plans. And while a recent YouGov survey shows a majority of Germans would like to see her take a tougher approach in forcing a national lockdown, several hurdles do remain, including convincing state leaders to keep Europe's biggest economy in hibernation for a little while longer. Trent Murray, CGTN, Frankfurt.
India has recorded its highest daily number of coronavirus infections as several states complain of a shortage of vaccines. More than 126,000 new cases were reported on Thursday. The government says the surge is due to crowds and a reluctance to wear masks as shops and offices reopen. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has rejected calls for a national lockdown despite the country struggling to contain a surge of coronavirus. Officials in Sao Paulo have begun an operation to dig thousands of graves as the daily death toll exceeds 4,000.
COVAX has delivered more than 38 million vaccine doses to over 100 countries. The global initiative aims to provide equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Dragan Jankovic is from the World Health Organization, a partner of the scheme, and he joins me now. Hello there. Can you put these COVAX numbers into perspective? I mean, how quickly is the world getting vaccinated?
Well, the problem is it's not quick enough, or it's not quicker than the virus is spreading around. As you mentioned in the few minutes before, the countries have ups and downs in epidemiology of diseases. And we can see here in the European region that more than 170,000 cases are reported daily and more than 4,000 deaths are reported daily. So from our point of view, it's not quick enough, and we are urging all our member states to do whatever is feasible and possible to have as many vaccines as soon near to the people and implemented vaccinating people. So that's the critical in this moment.
I mean, how worried is the WHO about the surge of COVID-19 in places like India, places like Brazil?
Well, I'm from European region, and two countries mentioned are not reporting to us directly, but altogether we are very concerned to see anywhere in the globe that the disease is spreading, because as we said many times, nobody's safe until everybody's safe. So the thing is that we need countries implementing these outbreak control measures. We need personal protection. We need distancing. We need hands washing, avoiding the crowded places. We need immunization. And we need people to understand there is fatigue in many of the countries. However, if we are not all together in this story, we will never reach the win against the disease.
But let's talk about the kind of vaccinations that are on the market, because we know there's a tiny risk now of blood clots connected to the AstraZeneca vaccine. However small the risk, I mean, how is the WHO concerned about public confidence and rollout?
There is a lot of talk about the vaccine and there is a lot of attention, and it's not good, that's for sure. The point is that in this moment, all authorities concluded that benefits of vaccination is much higher of any eventual risk. I just have to stress again, both agencies that take statements, EMA and MHRI, stated there is possible, but is still to confirm what is the relation. And many times, few of them mentioned that they taking precautions measures or they're expecting that national authorities will follow. The Global Advisory Committee for Vaccine Safety of WHO is stating that it's not confirmed and the benefits of vaccination are much higher than the risk. And in this moment, we have almost 200 doses given globally. We have almost 50 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine given in European region countries. And we would like to see more and more information from the countries about that or similar events. I have to stress, these are all new products, and we have a phase 4 now. Implementing vaccine, we are discovering extremely rare events that can happen after the vaccination. So we are grateful for the NRAs in the countries, national regulatory authorities, for follow-up and reporting this event. And we want to see more on the global level, and we want to see interventions, something like that happen, because it's modifying our activities.
Dragan Jankovic from the WHO, thank you.
Well, it's now a year since Wuhan, the centre of China's coronavirus outbreak, lifted a hard 76-day lockdown. The city has been on the road to recovery since then and has managed to retain its place in the country's top 10 for GDP. Hu Chao reports.
Wuhan is one of the core cities along the Yangtze River economic belt, playing a leading role in the development of central China. The metropolis has a population of over 10 million people and is home to many major companies and manufacturers. But last year's COVID-19 outbreak and the month-long lockdown took a heavy toll on the city's once vigorous economy. Its GDP in the first quarter of last year suffered a sharp decline of about 40%. Despite a recession, Wuhan soon recovered and grew rapidly over the next 3 quarters. Official statistics show Wuhan's GDP in 2020 exceeding 1,560 billion yuan, or about $240 billion, putting it in the top 10 in China. Professor Huang Manyu explains how Wuhan made such a miraculous turnaround.
The country offered Wuhan a package of favorable policies to help it recover, including financial support, tax reduction, and the introduction of projects.
Consumption in Wuhan also fell dramatically. Local authorities handed out vouchers worth a total of 500 million yuan to encourage consumption. That's nearly $80 million. The vouchers leveraged consumption worth 5.6 billion yuan, or more than $850 million.
Wuhan has great potential for consumption. Last year was difficult for Wuhan, but its total retail sales of consumer goods put it in the top 10 in China. That means the epidemic only had a short-term impact on the city, and it won't stop Wuhan from becoming an international consumption center in the future.
A crisis also brings opportunities. Local officials say Wuhan will seek high quality and innovative development in the future and take the lead among cities in central China. Hu Chao, CGTN, Wuhan.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, hard Brexit, hard cheese. We'll tell you why there's a bit of a stink over Stilton.
More than 100,000 people in Italy have now died from COVID-19.
The vaccination programme offers some hope for the future, but intensive care units are near capacity.
The Spanish government is hoping to vaccinate over 1 million people by next month.
Living in Germany are struggling with their mental health.
Hungary is supplementing the EU's vaccine rollout, buying doses from Russia and China to speed up the process.
4 million people have tested positive in France.
After a grim winter, the promise of a spring bloom that could mean freedom for millions.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Roger, Ricky, last clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no. We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Juliet Mann. Our top stories: police attacked and buses burned. Northern Ireland erupts into violence in the worst disturbances in years. Myanmar's ambassador to the UK sleeps in his car after being locked out of his embassy and fired from his job. The European Court of Human Rights rules compulsory COVID vaccinations may be necessary.
President Joe Biden is to sign several executive actions against gun violence after mass shootings in the United States in recent weeks. The White House says the measures will target homemade ghost guns, weapons which have no serial numbers or identification marks, as well as tighter controls on pistols. Let's talk to our correspondent, Jim Spellman, who's in Maryland. Jim, so a revamp then of federal gun policy. Talk us through it.
Sure. Joe Biden calling gun violence in the U.S. an international embarrassment as he rolled out these executive orders. Keep in mind, there's really a limit to what Joe Biden can do here through executive order, but they want to send a clear message that this is a priority for the administration. So the first would be efforts to limit, as you mentioned, these so-called ghost guns. Now, believe it or not, you can go to a gun show here in the United States or even go online to a website and essentially order all of the parts you need to put together a gun. You drill a few holes and assemble it, and then you have an untraceable gun that doesn't even have a serial number. So Biden wants these guns to be treated the same as a complete gun, to require background checks and have serial numbers that can be traced by law enforcement, as well as changes to these so-called stabilizing braces that can essentially turn a pistol into a rifle. Also, Joe Biden saying that he wants a new so-called red flag legislation that would basically bar people that are in crisis, having mental health episodes, or have made threats against former romantic partners, etc., from being able to buy guns. Those laws, though, happen on a state level, so there's a limit to what the president can do, also vowing to spend $5 billion on anti-violence initiatives in American neighborhoods. Now, as you can imagine, the National Rifle Association, pro-gun politicians here in the U.S. are already speaking out, calling this a Biden gun grab. Joe Biden, however, says the Second Amendment was never intended to be without limits. Listen.
No amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. We call it freedom of speech. From the very beginning, you couldn't own any weapon you wanted to own. From the very beginning, the Second Amendment existed. Certain people weren't allowed to have weapons. So the idea is just bizarre to suggest that some of the things we're recommending are contrary to the Constitution. Gun violence in this country is an epidemic. Let me say it again. Gun violence in this country is an epidemic, and it's an international embarrassment.
Jim, we know that Biden has some legislative priorities. I'm thinking the pandemic, infrastructure. But where do gun controls come on that list?
Right. So, as I mentioned, there's a real limits to what the president can do through executive action. For real fundamental change, he would need Congress. But the very divided political system in the United States at the moment makes significant legislation almost impossible. Just last month, the U.S. House of Representatives passed 2 bills that would slightly expand background checks before buying guns. They have broad support amongst the American people, and they have almost no chance of making it through the Senate, where the Democrats would have to cobble together 60 votes, requiring 10 Republicans to come to their side to pass that. Likewise, Joe Biden has said he would like to see an assault weapons ban renewed. That expired almost 20 years ago. Almost impossible. So I think we can expect to see Joe Biden continue to speak out about these issues and continue to use executive actions wherever there's a little bit of wiggle room. But we don't expect this White House to spend political capital on issues that essentially have no chance of truly passing. Juliet?
Jim Spellman, thanks for that.
6 Southern African leaders are meeting in Mozambique's capital, Maputo, to discuss security following an attack last month by extremist rebels in the country's Cabo Delgado province. Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack, which has left thousands of people either killed or displaced. Mozambique's army regained control of the city of Palma after battling with the rebels for 10 days. Well, CGTN's correspondent Angelo Coppola is following the summit from Johannesburg. South Africa is among the countries taking part in this emergency summit, along with the leaders from Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, Botswana and Zimbabwe. Angelo, first of all, what's the current situation in Cabo Delgado province?
Well, we'll scroll forward to, or backwards, in fact, to the evening of the 2nd of April. The reports then started emerging that insurgents had, in fact, begun attacking an area outside of the Total LNG project in the Afungi area, which is just outside of the town of Palma, where between 20 and 30,000 displaced people had gathered for shelter and refuge. Some reports claim that the insurgents were, in fact, fighting with government forces, charged with protecting that site, while others said that the attacks were targeted at those displaced civilians staying in the area or that resettlement village just outside of Total's fenced-in facility. The extent of the attacks and the casualties are still unknown, but the country's president did confirm on Wednesday on national television that the insurgents had in fact retreated from the town. And then in related news on Sunday, that's the 4th of April, the government's military contractors, or mercenaries as you will, took their aircraft and their choppers and they left the province because their contract with the Mozambican police hadn't been renewed. We do know now that the hole in the government's rotary wing is going to be filled, or probably will be filled, by Paramount Group, which is a South African air defense firm, which has a year-long contract with the Mozambican military to sell helicopters and to train pilots. So the situation in that province and in and around Palma is still tense, and in fact analysts are expecting the insurgents to go on the offensive again quite soon. Jamie?
And what about this emergency meeting in Maputo, and what are the expectations from that?
Well, surprisingly enough, the meeting ended early, despite what analysts say was a range of very complex issues that needed to be dealt with by the 6 leaders, including the Mozambican president. In fact, the meeting communique was issued 3 hours ago, and there was only one action item in that 2-page document. The group of 6 regional leaders have directed the Secretariat of the SADC grouping to develop a technical deployment back to Mozambique, and then to have another meeting on the 28th and 29th of April. And that's to report back on findings and recommendations. Sadly, those terms of reference of that technical deployment are unknown. We don't know how much, we don't know who, we don't know when, and we don't know how the SADC grouping or Mozambique are going to actually tackle the insurgents and deal with them. So as it stands right now, we have a situation of more meetings, more analysis, but no action plan to actually sort out what's going on in the area and to deal with those insurgents, Jamie.
Angelo Coppola in Johannesburg, thank you very much.
A Hong Kong opposition activist says he's been granted political asylum in Britain. Nathan Law was one of several student leaders who joined mass protests in 2019. He arrived in the UK last year after a sweeping national security law was imposed in Hong Kong. The UK says the law undermines the city's autonomy and freedom of speech. China says Nathan Law is wanted by Hong Kong police and accuses the UK of sheltering criminals.
We resolutely oppose the shielding of criminals in any way by any country, organization or individual. If the British side openly stands for Hong Kong independence and provides so-called asylum to wanted criminals, it's gross interference in Hong Kong's judicial system and violates international law and the basic norms of international relations.
The UK Communities Secretary says the government will help Hong Kong citizens who seek to move to the country get access to housing, schools and jobs. About 27,000 people have applied to live in Britain for 5 years under a new visa scheme brought in after China imposed the national security law in Hong Kong. China has criticised the visa scheme as a violation of international law.
Now, all this week, we're looking into the impact of the UK's departure from the European single market. On Monday, we heard about the drop in trade between the UK and the EU that followed the end of the Brexit transition period. And that's been particularly severe when it comes to the trade in food, as Juliet now explains.
The UK government has delayed checks on food imports until October, but Britain's food exports to the EU have faced new controls and paperwork since January. Already we've seen sharp falls in shipments of food in both directions. What effect might this have on Britain's eating habits? According to government figures, the UK produces about half of its food, although economists point out that includes things like tea, which are grown elsewhere but packaged here. The other half is imported, with over a quarter coming from EU member states, including most of the UK's fresh fruit and vegetables, imports of which are down almost a fifth in January compared to last year. The UK also imports beef and pork from Europe and exports beef and lamb to it. But the EU's introduction of checks in January saw UK meat sales to the EU fall 59% year on year. British farmers say, why not replace that Danish pork with some homegrown Welsh lamb? UK exports of fish and shellfish to the EU were even harder hit, down 83%. So Britons are being encouraged to eat more seafood, like this spider crab, which is being rebranded as a Cornish crab to make it sound more palatable. And what shall we have to drink with our food? 55% of UK wine imports come from the EU. The Food and Drink Federation says imports are down 20% year on year, and traders are warning that the extra paperwork could put an extra $1 on the price of a bottle. English vineyards hope that will make their wine more competitive in Britain and encourage drinkers to try the UK's own, not at all gross domestic product instead. Well, from wine, naturally, we proceed to cheese. The UK produces 750 different varieties of cheese, more than are found in France, but the French eat twice as much of the stuff. So the loss of export markets in Europe has hit British cheesemakers hard. Kitty Logan went to find out what they're doing about it.
It's a daily ritual, as it's been for over 100 years. Amid this rural landscape of the Derbyshire Dales, cows line up for milking at the Hartington Creamery. It's the first step in a traditional cheese-making process, the 200-strong herd providing the vital ingredient to create a handcrafted blue cheese, carefully matured and graded before it reaches the table. Until Brexit, EU consumers enjoyed a slice of this too. But now that trading relationship is off.
Since Brexit, we have had zero access to that same EU consumer market, and that is purely because we no longer have an equal, balanced, fair trade situation in place.
The company says the cost of new export certificates required to ship cheeses to the EU makes the process unviable. This is one of the oldest traditional makers of Stilton in the country. And like many cheese companies, it's really suffered with the changes post-Brexit. But now it's a question of adapting to survive. That means selling to the US and Canada instead, and closer to home.
What has actually happened is that there has been a renaissance in looking towards all British producers recently, and I think people are actually realising that the best cheese in the world was always on their doorstep.
And so the domestic market for British-made cheese is growing. UK cheese exports to the EU fell by 85% in January this year. Cheese imports from Europe were also down by a third. And that means British consumers are choosing more locally made products. Sales of this organic soft cheese from the Nettlebed Creamery in Oxfordshire have surged.
The three main reasons would be Brexit and the difficulty of importing continental artisan cheeses, another lockdown, which has increased footfall to small producers like us from our local population. And thirdly is, I think, an emerging trend of people really developing a greater appreciation of locally sourced small businesses like ourselves, where the provenance is absolutely guaranteed.
The company is now expanding, setting up a new store and takeaway cafe. A lockdown collection service is already popular with locals.
We're farmhouse, which means we use milk from our own farm. We're artisan, which means we do everything by hand. We have very few machines in the creamery. And what we have found is that since the first lockdown this time last year, there's been a huge increase in people appreciating the kind of business that we are.
The government says other factors like the pandemic contributed to low food exports to the EU in January, and things will improve. But UK cheesemakers are already wrapping up the domestic market. And with little prospect of change to those new regulations, British cheeses may well end up staying with local consumers. Kitty Logan, CGTN, Derbyshire.
Well, Peter Alexander is a senior lecturer in global food security at the University of Edinburgh. I asked him if there was any discernible disruption to food supplies or even food shortages following Brexit.
I don't think there are any food shortages. As far as the consumers perceive Brexit within the mainland of the UK, Scotland, England and Wales, there hasn't really been a great disruption from Brexit. Northern Ireland's been slightly worse affected as far as the consumers being concerned, at least in the beginning, and the regulations haven't been fully enforced, and they've been loosened to try and accommodate those trade flows that are needed between both the rest of the UK and of course the EU.
COVID and Brexit worried customers, it worried the big supermarkets. There was this concern about whether or not Britain would have enough food to put on the shelves of the shops. Maybe it is time for the UK and other countries to become much more self-sufficient and stop flying food around the world on these rather fragile food chains.
Yes, I mean, you're right. There's two parts to your question, I suppose. There was a lot of concern about how the pandemic would play out with Brexit, and indeed, there was the hiatus in transport to France just before the turn of the year, and that did cause a few days of logistics not being able to flow as normal. But the second half of your question was about whether a shift to more local food, greater self-sufficiency within the UK would be more sustainable and desirable. And I think it's actually a lot more complicated than that. If we're thinking that local food is often mentioned as something that can achieve lots of beneficial outcomes, greater sustainability, higher resilience and so forth. But actually I think it's something that needs to be thought out in a lot more detail. Globalization within the food system has created lots of opportunity for a more efficient system. And if we roll that back and have a much more local system, then it could be less efficient, have higher environmental costs and actually not be as resilient.
And I guess when you look at the figures, it is going to be difficult to separate the effects of Brexit and the effects of the pandemic on the story of food supply this year, isn't it?
It's always difficult to try and separate these things. Yes, I mean, that's for sure. But obviously, hopefully we're moving out of the pandemic now, and the effects of Brexit are going to be with us far longer. Having said that, as I say, from a consumer perspective, I don't think they're that great. That doesn't mean that some individual producers won't be far more greatly affected. You know, if we're thinking about the impact on producers of more perishable goods, such as seafood, for example, is a good example, or fish, where, you know, delays in shipping those products can make them perish, then they have been extremely badly affected. But that is quite different to how consumers within the UK have fared, I suppose.
Among the UK's export industries is, of course, culture, not least music, in Friday's special Brexit coverage. The show must go on. We look at the barriers British bands might now face when they try to tour Europe, and vice versa.
And our special Brexit coverage continues all this week on television and online, with a special social media show on Sunday when we'll hear more personal stories from those affected.
Started to get the sense that the tide was turning. And I remember, you know, the day after the result came in, I went to my place of work, and the whole town just was filled with a sense of mourning and dread, and that's pretty much, you know, I went to work with a knot in my stomach.
Now, if you're sitting there thinking, it doesn't seem much to a television anchoring job, and if you're thinking, I could do that, well, now's your chance. CGTN is in search of new talent. Leo Jarshin has the story.
Are you a reporter, presenter, podcaster, or social media influencer, hungry to find a platform to show off your talent? Well, here it is. Challengers and innovators are sure of a warm welcome and growth here at CGTN.
This is my 21st year at CGTN, and the best of it is you get to meet all these great people from different circles, from different walks of life, and they all have great stories to share.
It is a diverse stage. It is an inclusive stage. I would say it is the stage where my dream came true.
It gives me the opportunity to also travel around throughout China, you know, visit ethnic minorities, also taste the most delicious food, so it's definitely a dream job.
Registration for the campaign is now open on the CGTN website. The whole campaign, which wraps up in August, includes online video auditions and practical exercises, as well as a final offline competition. Winners may be offered full-time or part-time jobs here at CGTN's headquarters in Beijing or 3 regional centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. Looking forward to seeing you guys as my new colleagues. CGTN, Beijing.
And talking of new talent, finally time to welcome a new arrival to the world, a baby white rhino, all 50 kilos of him. The precious new arrival was born at a zoo in Arnhem in the Netherlands, endangered in the wild because of poaching for its horn. Mum was probably rather relieved the young one was born without one.
The headlines again. Police attacked and buses burned. Northern Ireland erupts in violence in the worst disturbances in years. Myanmar's ambassador to the UK sleeps in his car after being locked out of his embassy and fired from his job. And the European Court of Human Rights rules compulsory COVID vaccinations may be necessary.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching. More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com. And do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, on YouTube and Dailymotion as well, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.